All right, so I'm going to go over a couple different ways to draft a Cami bralette, and also how to turn it into a camisole, a few hacks at the end, and then I'll also have a sewing tutorial on how I put it all together. There's a lot I want to cover, and I'm going to try and keep it as concise and make sense as possible. I will include in the comment section below key times if you want to jump ahead to different things. So start with a ruler, draw a line down here, and this is your center front. And then you're going to measure yourself, and instead of taking all your measurement of your bust all the way around, you're just going to take the front of your bust. So from one side rib to the other side rib, and divide that by 2, and that's going to be half of your front chest drawn here. And also you can make note of your bust point here. Then you're going to measure from your bust point down to your under bust. This isn't where the bralette is going to end because we'll also have a band attached, but this is where the part of the bralette itself, excluding the band, would end. So adjust this for what you want, for how long you want it to be, and then you're going to measure all the way around your under bust at that point and divide it by 4 and draw a line across and mark it. Next, you're going to decide how far up you want the neckline to be. This is in the center of your neckline, so this could be the lowest point of your neckline where your cleavage is. So you're going to measure up and make a note, and then you're also going to make a note of how far up you want it into your armpit. So it says bust to top of armpit, and I don't mean like right into your armpit unless that's what you want. So just measure and mark how far you want it up to your armpit. Next, you're going to decide where you want your strap placement to be. So for me, I like to measure up from my bust point to where I want the strap to attach, and then I like to go over towards my armpit by 1 inch. That's my personal preference. It's a good spot to start, but play around with what you want and make a dot there. Next, we're going to connect all the points. So this, you're going to have a nice gradual curve here, a nice curve coming in here, and this is going to be a curved line encompassing your chest measurement down to your underbust measurement. Straight line across here, straight line up. That's your front piece. Now the back. Again, start with a line, straight line for your center back, and then measure across your half back measurement, just like we did at the front, from your side rib to your side rib across your back. And divide that by 2. Same thing here. This is going to be the same measurement that you used for your front, for how far down the bralette goes, and a line across for 1/4 of your underbust measurement. So these are the same from our front pattern piece. Next, you're going to decide how far up you want it to be in the back. This can be the same as the front, this could be lower, whatever your preference is. So draw that in here. And then this height is also the same from the front piece, how far up it comes to where it meets under the armpit. And then you just connect all these lines together. So for me, I like my back to dip down just slightly, so I've got a gradual curve coming in here. And then again, a curved side area here, straight across the bottom, straight up the side. That's your back piece. Now you can also do it, so if you noticed, my straps are going to come in here and it's going to be flat all across the back. If you want to have a dip up like this on the back, like you see on some camisoles, you can do the same thing as we did with the front. Decide how far up you want it to be and the placement of it, and mark a dot there, and have it come up and come back down. So now we need some negative ease, because what we created was just based off of your exact measurements. So there's 0 ease, which means it would be a slim cami, but not necessarily what you would want for a bralette. -1 to -2 negative ease would give you a fitted cami. -2 to -5 would give you a supportive fitted bralette or swimwear. So for the purpose of this, I have chosen 4 inches of negative ease. So we're going to divide that ease by 4 because you have a side seam on both sides of the front piece and a side seam on both sides of the back piece. So it has 2 side seam edges on the front, 2 side seam edges on the back. So we're going to divide the ease by 4. And so 4 divided by 4 we know is 1. So also, because I don't want to just take the ease from the side seams, I don't want to just take the ease from the side seams. I'm going to divide that ease by 2. So it splits the reduction between both the center fold and the armpit side seam. So 1 inch divided by 2 equals half an inch. So I'm going to take half an inch from here and here and redraw in a curve here, redraw in my center line here, everything else stays the same. Quicker way to get to that is just to go for your negative ease divided by 8, and then you'll get there. Next, we're going to take care of these little points here for when we're attaching our binding for our straps. So for me, my straps, once they're finished, are 3/8 of an inch wide. So I'm going to measure 3/8 of an inch across the top here and cut it off so it's flat. If your binding is going to be finished at a different width, then you would measure for that width and cut across. Do the same on the back piece if you've done the pointed top on the back. So now we're going to measure from here, so remember on your body where you marked for where you want the strap to attach, all the way up to the top of your shoulder, and do the same on the back piece. These are the back strap and the front strap measurements. So now we're going to calculate the binding. There's 2 different ways that you can sew your garment together. This video, when I show how I'm sewing it, I'm showing it this way up top, but you can also do it the bottom way. So the first way is you want to measure your front binding, so the curve along here, that's the blue one, multiply it by 2, and then by 0.85 to 0.9. So that takes into account the stretch of the knit, so then you're going to stretch your binding just slightly when attaching it. Now the armpit of the front and the full strap in green here, you're going to add all those together and then multiply by 0.85 to 0.9. Now if you had the pointed back here, you would also be adding in that back armpit measurement as well. And then in orange we have the back binding. So you're going to measure this, multiply it by 2, and then multiply it by 0.85 to 0.9. When you're doing binding this way, you are binding everything first, and then you are sewing your side seams last. This method, you are sewing your side seams first, and then you're going to have one long piece of binding that goes across the back, the armpit, and the strap, so it encases the top seam allowance of the side seam. So this way, you would do the same with the front binding as the top one, measure here, multiply by 2, and then by 0.85 to 0.9. And then for the straps, you're going to measure all across the back, multiply that by 2. You're going to measure all across the back, the armpit, the front strap, the back strap, and then multiply that number by 2, and then by 0.85 to 0.9. This is going to be a very long piece of binding, and you may actually need to cut 2 pieces and seam them together if your fabric's not wide enough. And now we have our bottom band. So this can be elastic, this could be knit. I also forgot to mention here, it would also be fun to just stitch on some lace elastic along here instead of doing binding. That would be a cute feature as well. So here we are going to measure across the bottom of our center front and the bottom of our center back. And then we're going to multiply that by 2 and then by 0.85 to 0.9. That will give you your length, and then you're going to have your height, and that's whatever you want it to be multiplied by 2. So for me, I like my finished band to be 1.5 inches tall. So then I multiply that by 2 and I'm cutting out 3 inches tall. And now finally we're going to add seam allowance all the way around the band. And that gives you your final measurement you're going to cut. Now we need to add seam allowance to the front and back piece because we're binding the edge at the top and the armpit and along the back. We don't add seam allowance there, but you add seam allowance to your side seams and to the bottom. So now we're moving on to cutting the binding. So we cut the binding so the stretch is going across this way. If I want my finished binding to be 3/8 of an inch, I'm going to cut my binding to be 1.5 inches tall. If doing method A, if I go back here doing this method, you're going to need to add seam allowance to the edges of where the armpit and strap binding and for the back binding. If you're doing method B, down here, you don't need to add seam allowance to what we measured over here. So it helps to really prep your pieces. You fold them in half so wrong sides are facing and give it a really good press. So there's my press line. And then you fold in the top and bottom edges to meet that press line and give it another good pressing. And so for the front binding, you're cutting 1 piece. For the back binding, you're cutting 1 piece. And then for the armpit and strap binding, you're cutting 2. That's for method A. Method B, you're only having 2 pieces of binding, 1 for the front and 1 that includes the back and the straps. So here I'm going to show how you can expand upon it if you want to turn your basic draft into a camisole. So what you can do is you can measure from your bust point down to your natural waist and mark it, and then mark a line across of what 1/4 of your natural waist measurement is. Your natural waist is the smallest part of your body. So usually around the bottom of your ribs is a good spot to start to find your natural waist. And then measure from there to however long you want your camisole to be. And then measure 1/4 of that measurement here. So for here, the purpose of this, I did a full hip. So this would be a very long camisole. Good for layering. So, and measure across there. And then you would bring your line in for wherever you want, however close you want it to hug into your natural waist and come down to your full hip. This would give you 0-inch ease with a little bit of ease at the waist because I haven't brought in the curve right to the natural waist. And do the same thing for the back. And now you have camisole pieces. Same binding measurements and everything that we did for the bralette. Another way you can draft a camisole is from a pattern that you already know fits you well. And typically this is what I would do. I have my slopers and I would use that. This is actually based off of the Dandelion Slim Fit tee. And I measured, the patterns are marked with your bust point, and I measured across my measurements on the front and the back, and I could see how much negative ease I wanted to bring in, and I could bring it in from there. Because it's already a knit garment, it's already been reduced on the fold here, so I don't need to worry about distributing my negative ease. And then I can see where the armpit of that shirt is, and I know how that armpit fits on me, and I can adjust in for the bralette and where I want it to go, and the neckline based on the different neckline options of that shirt. And this large circle here is actually drawn in to show a bust radius, which can show you, so you understand where you want your bralette to end and how low you want it to go if you don't want to expose any cleavage or any bust. It's just a way to make sure you're including coverage everywhere you want to have coverage. And then from here you would measure straps from here up to the shoulder point, like I have over here with the dotted line. So that's another way you can go about doing it as well. All right, so I've attached my neck binding for the front and the back. So the right side of the binding is facing the wrong side of the larger piece. And I've stitched I do between 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch, just so it gives me a little bit of leeway when I do all the folding up. So now what we're going to do is fold it all to the right side and press and pin. Because I'm working with a super slinky rayon knit, I don't pre-press my binding into quarters, but ideally that would save you some effort here. So what you would do now is I would just press up my seam allowance here. Had to put my phone down so I could use both my hands. So you'd press your seam allowance up here, and you would fold this in half to meet the seam allowance and press, and then fold it down over top so it just covers your stitching. And you're going to do that all the way across, press, 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 pin in place, and then you're going to top stitch near the edge. And I'll show you what that looks like on this one. See, so I've done the whole thing all the way across and how it looks on the back. So you do that with the front and the back pieces. So then you go ahead and do the armpit strap binding the same way that we attach the front and back binding. Excuse me. And then you stitch it on here, and then you have your straps all folded in fourths too, and carry all the way on to the end. So that's all done now. Now you'll take your front and back pieces and place them right sides together, and you will stitch down the sides with your seam allowance. Once that's stitched, it's a good time to try it on, because depending on your fabric, you may, or your personal preference, you may prefer to take in an even wider seam allowance if you have a super stretchy fabric and you want it to be more supportive. So now is a good time to do that before we measure and attach the bottom band. Just a quick note, if you were not doing it in the same steps I was, for example, if you wanted to do binding that encompassed from the armpit all across the back and the strap, so it was one long binding piece, you would actually stitch your front and back pieces right sides together first, and then you would add the front binding, and then you would go ahead and attach the binding all across the back, the armpit, and the straps in one go. The con to that is if you don't know whether or not you need to take in the side seams. By doing it the way that I've done it, you can take in the side seams if necessary, if that's not important to you, or you know for sure it'll fit how you want it to fit. This is a great way to enclose the side seams so you get a nice flush finish across the top. Next, clip or pin. Pin will be more secure when you're pulling this over your head. The straps in place where you want them in the back, and try it on. This is also a time where you may find you need to shorten the straps. I find when I use slinky knits like this, I do have to shorten the straps about 1 inch in length for my preference. So try it on, figure out strap placement and length, and then you will go ahead and you'll stitch along your stitching line. And I also add another row of stitching along the top to secure it in place. And then for your band at the bottom, take a ruler and measure across here, making sure it's laying flat, and multiply that by 2 because there's 2 layers here. And then I like to take that measurement and multiply it somewhere between 0.85 to 0.9, depends on how snug you like your band at the bottom, and that will be your length plus seam allowance, and then whatever height you want it to be multiplied by 2 because it gets folded in half plus seam allowance. So I have stitched my band, so right sides together on the sides, and then turned it out to be a loop right sides out, folded in half so all of your edges are at the top, and then go ahead and mark the quarter mark. So you've got the edges. Mine has 2 seam allowances because my fabric wasn't wide enough to do a full band because I'm just cutting up an old dress. So these are quarter marks, and then the halfway in between, and then do the same thing on the bra. And we'll zoom it out here, and then pin it to match the quarter marks so the right sides of the band is facing the right sides of the bra all the way around. And you're just going to sew all the way around in a big loop, and then that'll fold down and you will be done. So now I'm going to show you some fun hacks or variations, I should say, that you could do with your draft once you're happy with how it turned out and the fit is good. You can play around with adding different strap detailing. So over here, we can see we've got straps going straight across. So on here, you would just mark and measure how far you want these pieces to be, and same as before, you would want to reduce the length by 0.85 to 0.9, multiplying that by that, and you would give you those measurements to add the bindings in there. This one has a V feature, and so same thing, you would mark where you want it, draw it down to the center front, make note of that measurement and reduce it. And here, if you want to have a crossover feature, you're going to need to trace or duplicate your pattern piece so that you can measure effectively from where you want it to be down to where you want it to be on the other side, and then measure that. So you can do this on the front or the back, but here I just showed it on the back, a nice little X feature. Also a fun feature, you could do a halter top, and instead of binding the edges, you can have a thicker band to go across. So I instantly think of like a swimwear top with this idea. So because I'd want to add a band instead of binding, I'd actually want to reduce how much fabric there is here on this pattern piece to account for the band that would actually be adding height and width here. So trim your pattern piece and measure that as a band plus the strap. And here you can see it comes up here and it would go behind the neck and knot and tie, which I think would be super cute. So those are just a couple ideas. There's so many if you browse through Pinterest, but once you've got the basic idea of what makes a good fit, then you can just start playing around with your pattern pieces, giving it different necklines, give it a halter neckline where it comes straight across or up higher, all sorts of options. So be sure to let me know if you give this a try, and I'd love to see what you make.